Hello, and welcome to Happy Queer Adults. You might know our guest today, Alease Daniel, as @Alease the Embryologist on TikTok and Instagram. She has a passion for not only reproductive health, but also teaching.
Which is why she started educating people on the fertility process on social, answering some of the most common questions and correcting some of the most common misconceptions.
Lauren and I started our own fertility process at the end of 2020. This process is hard, and navigating it as a queer couple can come with some nuances.
So if you're interested in reproductive health and fertility, this is an interview you don't want to miss. We talked about all things LGBTQ plus fertility, from how to choose a sperm donor and buy sperm safely, to trans fertility preservation, to the effects of overturning Roe will have on the IVF process.
All right, let's play the interview.
Let's do it. Hi, how's it going?
Hi, so happy to be here.
We're so happy to have you. So if you want to start with just introducing yourself, name, pronouns, how you identify, what you do,
Yeah.
how you're doing today.
Awesome. Okay, cool. Yeah, my name is Alease Daniel. My pronouns are she, her. I am an embryologist, so that means that I work in an IVF lab, doing all of the lab work, growing embryos, freezing embryos, doing egg retrievals, all of that sort of thing. So anyone who is out there, kind of going through the IVF process or trying to conceive, whether it be on your own or with a partner, that's my field of expertise.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into embryology? Like, what did that path look like for you?
Yeah, so I have a bachelor's degree in genetics and a minor in biotechnology from NC State, which I loved. I had a fantastic experience there. But in my last semester, I was like, okay, I have to figure out what I'm gonna do. I'm graduating soon, and I knew I wanted to work in a lab, but I knew I didn't want to do research. And I always kind of had an interest in women's health, reproductive health, sex education, that sort of thing. So I wanted to see what I could do in that field. So I just did some Googling, found IVF and the world of IVF, and I was like, oh my gosh, this seems like a great fit. And so I reached out to every single clinic in my area to see if I could go shadow or intern, or just give me some information. And that got my foot in the door at a clinic, and I was able to train there and train all the way into embryology.
That's amazing. How long did that process take you?
So right before I left my previous clinic, I was just fully trained. So it took about 4 years for me. And I would say that's a little bit on the longer side for most embryologists. The first year I was there, I wasn't really sure if I wanted to stay in the field. So I kind of slowed down my training myself because I was like, oh, I don't want to do this. So I'd say most embryologists are trained 2 to 3 years, but it took me a little bit longer. So it's, on the 4-year side.
Slow and steady. I like it.
Exactly.
How did you decide to start sharing, and sort of what was your motivation for sharing a lot of what you do on TikTok, Instagram?
So I was the only full-time person in the lab for a long time. And so I was the person who answered all the phone calls, answered all the portal messages, all of that from patients. And I saw that we were consistently getting the same questions over and over. And that made it very clear to me that a lot of patients weren't really understanding what was happening in the lab. So I went to our physicians and said, hey, I'd love to add some sort of education component about the lab. Patients already have to do a nurse coordination class where they learn how to do their meds and all of that. I was like, I can just tack it on to the end of that. They weren't really on board with that. I think it was just not something they were interested in. And I was like, okay, fine. So I decided to start on social media. I figured, well, if they're not on board, that's fine. But I know it's not, if it's happening here, it's happening everywhere. So let me just get on social media. And I actually started on Instagram, and my siblings are younger than me. And they're the ones that were like, no, you got to get on TikTok. That's where, you can reach more people or whatever. And I was kind of like, yeah, I don't know. But I'm so glad that I listened to them, because that's where most of my following is now, is on TikTok. So I will say that it reaches a broader audience, but it's been really cool to meet so many people. I've gotten so many cool opportunities, and definitely spread so much information, and just the messages I get from people like updating me on their journey, or just saying, hey, like this really helped me through, what we were going through. It really makes it worth it and keeps me kind of wanting to produce more content and more education and all that.
It's so interesting. It sounds like you had a very client-facing role in the clinic that you were working in. Do you find that that's typical of embryologists, or are embryologists usually behind the scenes?
For the most part, embryologists are behind the scenes. And honestly, I was behind the scenes too. It's just when I got questions, they were always very similar questions. Like compared to a nurse, we're much more behind the scenes. And it really depends on the clinic. So some clinics will have their embryologists call patients with every update in the lab. The clinic I was at didn't do that. We sent like an email update. So I didn't talk to them on the phone that much, but there are lots of clinics who do the phone call thing. So it really depends on the clinic, but I would say for the most part, the lab staff is kind of, most patients don't know who we are or what we do. Like a patient wouldn't recognize me in the clinic as knowing that I'm their embryologist. They see me in scrubs, they probably think I'm a nurse or something like that. But yeah, it's kind of more mysterious. And I think that's another reason why we get so many questions, is because it's not explained. You don't get to see it, it's not explained, and they don't know who we are. And so it just seems very mysterious, the whole lab thing.
Yeah, I think the only time we met the embryologist that we were working with was when she handed us a photo of the embryo that they were transferring on transfer day. And I think that was the beginning and the end of the relationship we had with her.
Yeah, that's very common. I mean, I would see patients on retrieval day just to do a timeout, like, can you verify your name, date of birth, blah, blah, blah. And then I would see them on transfer day. And that's basically it. So there isn't a whole lot of face-to-face with patients, but we're such a big part of the process that I think it's, a good thing to have as much information about what's going on back there.
Absolutely.
What are some of the most common questions or misconceptions that you run into?
So my most asked question is on embryo grading, 100%, because they get this report, they have no idea what the numbers and the letters mean, all of that. So I get that question a lot. And I've done a couple of videos on it on TikTok, but I really want to do a more, cohesive lesson, if you will. So that's definitely my most asked question. I think a lot of patients have questions about collecting and the sperm side of things. So like, what does the collection room look like? What are you doing? What do the counts mean? How are you counting? How do I transport my sample? A lot of questions around collecting and bringing their sample in, that sort of thing. I would say those are my top two topics that I get asked about the most. And then there are sometimes on social media, people will ask me about stuff and I'm like, I've never heard that. I've never heard of that. I cannot answer this question. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm like, I can Google some stuff, but I would absolutely ask your doctor about that. Because things can be so different between clinics that all I can do is speak to my experiences as an embryologist. And some things are pretty standard, but protocols differ a little bit between labs. So sometimes I'm like, I haven't heard of that. I would absolutely ask your doctor about that.
And for any of our listeners who maybe haven't started this process or haven't gotten that far into this process, what does it mean? What does embryo grading mean?
Yeah, so when your embryos have grown to day 5, 6, or 7, there's a few things we can do with them. We can transfer them fresh. We can freeze them. We can biopsy and freeze them. And then if they're really poor quality, they get discarded. So the quality of the embryo helps us determine what we want to do with the embryos. And so to determine the quality, we give them a grade based on the ICM, which stands for inner cell mass. That's what becomes a baby. And then we grade them based on their trophectoderm, and that's what becomes the placenta. And then around the embryo, there's like a shell, and that is the zona. And as the embryo grows, that zona gets thinner and thinner. And so that's the number in the beginning. So that tells us how expanded the embryo is. And then that combines with the ICM and the trophectoderm to give us a grade. So, there's good, fair, poor, and that kind of some people read more into the grades than others. Again, that's another one that depends on the clinic. Some clinics are really particular about the grades, and some clinics are like, it looks good, it's fine. So, it really depends on the clinic as to how much weight they put into the grade. But my biggest concern as an embryologist in terms of the embryo grade is we're putting the embryos through a lot of stress most of the time. If we're biopsying them, then we're taking some cells from the embryo. We could be freezing it, we have to thaw it, all of those things. So we want to make sure it can survive all of that stress that we're putting it under. And so that's why, that's the most important thing that I'm looking for when I'm looking at an embryo grade, because I'm like, okay, this embryo is borderline. Do I think it's going to survive all of these things? If an embryo only has 20 trophectoderm cells and we're taking 5, that's a much bigger deal than if an embryo has 100 trophectoderms and we're taking, or 100 trophectoderm cells and we're taking 5. So, that kind of comes into consideration when I'm considering if this embryo is a good enough quality to put it under all the things that we're going to put it through.
Yeah. That's so interesting. I never really thought about it from that perspective of, will the embryo survive all of the stressors that we're putting it through? We just thought about it in terms of viability, and that's how it was conveyed to us. But that's very interesting. It was something I'd never even thought about going through the process.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people don't think about that side of it because, oftentimes it does, patients are considering the viability, is this going to give me a better chance of getting pregnant, that sort of thing. But there are lots of poor quality embryos that make babies all the time. So I think about it more as a survivability through all the processes that we're putting it under. Because we can have, and same thing with genetic normalcy. When patients are doing PGTA testing, they're like, okay, well, this lower quality embryo is more likely to be abnormal. And that's not really true. We have great quality embryos that are abnormal and vice versa. So, we can't really tell the genetics of the embryo based on the grade. And so that's another question I get in combination with embryo grading. They're like, okay, well, is this one more likely to be abnormal? And not really,
Yeah, I think all of our abnormal embryos were AA embryos. Yeah. And we had family members who had no idea what they were talking about, but telling us basically that we didn't need to do genetic testing because all of our embryos were AA and AB, and we went through it anyways. But it just also goes to show the level of correct information that people can pull from Google.
Yeah, there's a lot of misinformation out there. And so that's another thing that I try to do with my platform is say like, hey, I know this logically, it makes sense. You think, oh, it looks good, it must be good genetically, but realistically, that is not the case. So I try to dispel some of that misinformation because it definitely gets kind of spread around somehow. And I'm like, that's not true.
Yeah.
So I'd love to talk a little bit about how your work intersects with queer couples, the queer community in general, anyone who's kind of in that space embarking on fertility journeys.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people in the LGBTQ plus community don't realize that they have options for building their families. And it always like hurts my heart a little bit because I'll get comments from people and they're like, I never knew that like this was an option or that I could have a family. And I'm like, yes, you can absolutely have a family. So, at my previous clinic, we helped a lot of different types of couples. We did a lot of fertility preservation for patients who are transitioning. So there's a lot of options out there. A lot of people who have a uterus will start at home inseminations. That's kind of common. It's also much more affordable than going into a clinic. For couples that both have sperm, though, it's a little bit more complicated. They usually do have to start kind of right at a clinic. So there's all sorts of ranges of treatment options, from home insemination all the way to reciprocal IVF and surrogacy. All of that is, there's a wide range of options out there. And for the most part, I mean, there are some things we can't do, but for the most part, the family that, the person or the couple is envisioning, we can usually work towards creating.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Can you go into more detail about some of the options that are available to LGBTQ couples or individuals?
Yeah, absolutely. So like I said, most couples that both have a uterus or ovaries will start with home insemination, where they are timing their cycles, they're timing their ovulation, and either using a known sperm donor or an anonymous sperm donor and doing an at-home insemination. that's where a lot of couples start or individuals start, because it's fairly inexpensive. You're not having to go to a doctor. There's not really a whole lot of medications involved and things like that. At that point, if they're not getting pregnant, they can come into the clinic and we can, do some ovulation induction where we put their body on some medications, get them to ovulate, and then time insemination that way. Now with both of those options, the person who is carrying the baby is also genetic. It's also genetically their egg. Mm-hmm. So if you have a partner who also has ovaries and a uterus, genetically they won't be related to the baby that you yourself is carrying. So with a lot of same-sex couples who both have uteruses, they both want to be involved, which I completely understand. So that option may not be the best for them. It really depends on who wants to carry, who wants to, be genetically related, all of those sorts of things. And so in that initial consult, we'll really, the doctor's really talking to them about like, what is your family vision? Do you have a desire to carry? Do you not have a desire to carry? What does that look like for you as a couple? And we can kind of go based on that on what sort of treatment options may be the best. Now, from that point, this is where couples who both have sperm or an individual who just has sperm kind of comes in, and that's IVF. We can do traditional IVF where the person's eggs we're taking is also the person who's carrying. We can do, the person who's carrying carries the other partner's eggs. And then with two partners who both have sperm, we can find an egg donor. I've seen where we fertilize half the eggs with one sperm source, half the eggs with another sperm source, and then we have a gestational carrier. I've had patients who want to know whose embryo it is. I've had patients who don't want to know. I've had patients who want to do one of each. There's so many, there's so many different choices you can have. And then we've got InvoCell, which is a little bit newer of a treatment option, and that is an actual physical device that is carried intravaginally. And we see that actually even just with our whole patient population. A lot of patients who chose that route were same-sex couples who both had uteruses, and they seem to really like that device. It's just it's supposed to be a intermediate treatment option between IUI and IVF, and it's conventional insemination. Typically they're having a fresh transfer, no PGTA, and it's just cultured intravaginally for about 5 days. We take it out, we see what embryos have been created, and then we place them in whoever is wanting to carry. So this kind of allows, if one partner doesn't want to carry the baby, but they may be willing to carry the device, and they're carrying the device, and they can both kind of be involved. So definitely lots of options out there. And then for those who are transitioning, fertility preservation is something that I like to talk about, because if anytime you're on hormone replacement therapy, that can affect your fertility. So if there's anyone out there who's considering transitioning, definitely talk to a doctor. If a family is something that you're considering in the future, you want to make sure you're preserving your sample, whether that be eggs or sperm, before you start hormone therapy. There have been times where we've had to take patients off hormone therapy for a little bit, just to get their their sperm samples up a little bit, or their egg quality a little bit better, and then do the procedure, and then they can get right back on hormones. So there's a lot of options out there, and even if you're not sure if you want a family in the future, especially for sperm cryopreservation, it's relatively affordable, and it's really easy to kind of toss if you decide later if you don't want it, But I always think it's always nice to have a little bit of peace of mind, just in case, you never know what life could throw at you, and then you've got it, frozen there for later, just in case.
Absolutely. And the clinics that you work at, do they typically store and preserve the embryos or sperm in-house, or do you send that out to another vendor?
So the clinic I used to work at, they had kind of a combination. So any patient who was actively in cycle, their embryos or sperm or eggs were stored on site for a year. And then after that point, they were sent off to a long-term storage facility. They used ReproTech. That's a pretty common one, which we loved working with them. I mean, it was super affordable. Compared to the cost of storage that we were charging patients is actually cheaper to store at ReproTech. And that's all they do. So, they've got the top-notch monitoring and all of that. So that works out really well. They've got a couple different locations across the country. So patients were able to kind of have peace of mind that wherever they move, they could be shipped to wherever they wanted to be, close to. And then I also know clinics who store everything on site in their lab. So it really depends on what clinic you're at and what your future plans are, because at ReproTech, you can say, hey, I'm not going to be using this for a long time. Let's do a 10-year storage option. We've had patients who are transitioning very young, like 14 or 15. And so they don't really have plans to use it for a long time. So they can easily send a ReproTech, say, hey, I'm not going to be using this for 10 years. Let's go ahead and pay it. And, it's there safe and sound.
That's great.
Yeah,
that's really great.
So we are starting a new section of the podcast called LGBTQ&A, where we get questions from audience members, and we had one for you actually from an audience member. So for couples who are starting on their fertility journey, what are the low and high end costs that they should plan for, and about how long does the process take from start to finish?
That's a great question. I think a lot of people have kind of an unrealistic expectation about how long it's going to take, because it can really take a long time. So I'll start with cost first, and then we'll talk about timeline. So cost, if both patients have a uterus and ovaries, cheapest cost, home insemination, you're basically just paying for the vial and potentially some sort of insemination device. I mean, you're looking at maybe $1,000.
And just to be clear, the vial is a vial of sperm, right?
A vial of sperm, whether that be a vial of donor sperm. So if you're using a known donor, you may home expose, meaning that they masturbate right before you're going to do the insemination. And so there's no processing or freezing or anything like that. So it can be even cheaper than that, depending on what type of donor you're using. Now, I will do a little PSA. If you're using a known donor, please be sure to get testing on them, legal contracts, infectious disease testing before you move forward, just because that's what we do for all donors. You want to be safe and not spread anything, things like that. And you want to make sure you have a good contract in place. So that's something I always like to mention. But yeah, and then once you get to the kind of clinic level, a TDI cycle, which is a time donor insemination cycle, those are also around $1,000 to $1,500, depending on the clinic, depending on what type of insurance you have. Thankfully, over the years that I've worked in the field, insurance coverage has gotten so much better. So most couples or patients have some sort of coverage, which is awesome, whether that be for diagnostic or a couple TDI cycles. That's much better than it used to be. So we're happy about that. On the high end, IVF itself, depending on where you are and depending on what you're doing, can run you about 10 grand. So, if you're doing ICSI, if you're doing PGTA testing, if you're freezing your embryos doing FET, that's going to cost more than a conventional insemination with a fresh transfer. So some of those things kind of build upon each other depending on what you're wanting. And then on the high end would be someone who needed a gestational carrier. And that is a very wide range of prices. So if you're using someone they may not charge you anything. They may do it out of the goodness of their heart, which is awesome. You may just be paying for their medical expenses. Maybe you decide to give them some compensation, whatever you just have decided on. If you're going through an agency for a gestational carrier, I mean, it can be anywhere from 20 grand to 100 grand. So it really depends on kind of whether you go agency route, what agency you go with. Because I'm very sure that whoever carried the babies for Kim Kardashian was Megan Payne. I doubt she was getting paid she was getting paid a lot. So it really depends on what kind of service you're looking at and that sort of thing. So it really can range from $1,000 to 50 grand. FET cycles are usually about 5 grand, 4 or 5 grand, depending on the clinic, depending on the insurance coverage. And that's when we thaw your embryo and place it back in the uterus. So wide range of costs. What was the other question? What was the other part of the question?
Time of the process.
Right. In terms of timing for insemination, so like a TDI or a home insemination, that's really like a month. So most patients, if they're coming in the clinic, may have a month of diagnostic work, and then they're able to jump right into a cycle. They do insemination on ovulation day or a couple days before ovulation day, and that's kind of that. For IVF, it definitely takes a little bit longer. So there's typically a month of diagnostic, then you are on stimulation medications, then you're doing your retrieval. If you're freezing, then you have to wait for genetic testing to come back. If you're doing PGTA, then you're doing FET. So I would say from first consult to actual transfer day, if you're doing an FET, I mean, it could be 3 or 4 months, depending on if they want to do diagnostics between the FET and the transfer. You know, if you have a partner who did the retrieval and you're carrying, you may be able to squish it a little bit because you can kind of do 2 things at once. It really depends, and it depends on the clinic, because sometimes clinics have a long wait for like a nurse class, or they're booked out for the actual transfer date. But I would tell patients 3 or 4 months, just to kind of give them an idea. So it does kind of take a while, typically much longer than patients think when they come in for their consult.
And I know that this will vary from individual to individual, but do clinics typically have recommendations on where to start? Like, not everybody's going to start with a frozen embryo transfer, although some people might. Is there for somebody who has a uterus and is, generally healthy, younger person, is there a place where they should consider starting?
Yeah, so I would say most clinics are starting with diagnostic work, because that's how we determine whether we think you should go into TDI or you should go straight to IVF. But I will say most LGBTQ couples that we see start with TDIs, because most of the time they're needing the sperm, and that's why they're there. So a lot of times they'll start with TDIs. If it's a couple that both have sperm, they're jumping right into IVF because there isn't really any other option. But I would say most couples that both have uteruses are starting TDIs. But if when we're doing that diagnostic work, we see that maybe there is a tubal factor, or a patient has diminishing ovarian reserve, or we do some genetic testing and find that they're a carrier for something significant, that may push, from a TDI to straight to IVF.
That makes sense.
Yeah. For individuals or couples that have exclusively uteruses, are there any tips or watch outs for, you mentioned a number of working with a known donor, but when you're just looking at sperm generally, there's so many things you see of washed or unwashed, motility, what are some of the watch outs that you look for, or things you look for that are, positive? Absolutely. So when we are advising patients what sort of vials they should buy, the first thing we're looking at is CMV status. So if you're CMV negative, you want to make sure that you have a donor who's also CMV negative, because they can pass CMV to you if they're positive and you're negative. So you want to make sure that matches. It's not as important with IVF because the sperm is going to be washed a few times. And it's typically not a huge deal. We've had patients who are negative who choose a positive donor for very specific reasons. And as long as they're aware of the risk of getting CMV and they're okay with it, then we're good. Another thing that we like to make sure patients are aware of is the genetics. So if you know that you're a carrier for cystic fibrosis, you really want to make sure that your donor isn't also a carrier for cystic fibrosis, because that gives any future child a higher risk of getting cystic fibrosis. So that's something that we advise patients on as well. And once a patient has chosen a donor, if they're working with the clinic is going to review those things, and they fill out what's called a donor eligibility determination. So that is just a piece of paper saying, hey, we looked at this donor in comparison to the recipient, and we've made sure that all of the important things check out, and we're saying that we reviewed that sort of thing. So typically before a patient has bought a vial, we have done that to make sure that everything matches up. And if there's anything that we are concerned about, the doctor will reach out to the patient and say, hey, we noticed this with your donor. Let's talk about it. Let's see if this is okay, or something that we need to reevaluate this donor altogether. In terms of the type of vial, there's so many different types of vials. There's IUI,
there's WASH, there's ART, IVF, and ICI, PrEP, all these different types of vials. That is also something that your doctor can advise you on. Mm-hmm. Some clinics have a preference for a specific type of vial. Pretty much any vial that is there can be used for a home insemination. So if you're planning a home insemination and the only thing your donor has is IUI ART, that can be used for home insemination. The biggest thing comes when we're doing TDIs, because with a TDI, that sample is going directly into your uterus versus it just going, in your vagina, close to the cervix. So we want to make sure that that sample is washed. And some clinics will allow unwashed samples. It just has to be washed in the lab. So that's something to consider. I always tell people to advise, ask the advice of their doctor, of their clinic, because at a previous clinic I worked at, we only accept IUI or washed samples, regardless of what the patient was doing. They typically had the best numbers and count guarantees and things like that. And also look at that, depending on what sperm bank you're working with. Some have different guarantee levels. So if we follow your sample for a TDI and the counts aren't looking great, we'll probably still go ahead and do that TDI, but then we can file a complaint with the cryobank and say, hey, this wasn't up to what you guaranteed we'd get. And the patient can also often get a replacement vial or a refund or something like that, because it didn't meet the guarantee. So, and all of that stuff is listed on their site, which is nice to go through, because I know there's a handful of sperm banks. There's a lot to choose from.
What's the difference between washed and unwashed for sperm vials?
Yeah, so washed sperm vials are put through a washing process in the lab, meaning that all of the ejaculate, so the stuff that's not swimmers, so you can separate the swimmers from all of the other fluids and cells and things like that come in ejaculate. And that is what causes the cramping when you are doing a TDI and it's being injected into the uterus. The reason that we want wash samples is because all that extra ejaculate will cause really severe cramping. So we want to make sure all of that is washed out before we put it in your uterus. Now, when you're doing an unwashed sample, none of that happens. So none of it's washed, it's raw ejaculate. And that's fine if you're doing an at-home insemination, because you're not able to actually get it in your uterus, because most people can't get, they don't have all the stuff to get it into your uterus. So that is not a problem. And it's just, it's very similar to actual intercourse, where there's no way that all the ejaculate is actually getting into the uterus. The cervix is there to kind of weed out any of the ejaculate and fluids and round cells and all of that sort of stuff.
I had no idea. So that was super helpful. I knew what the difference was, but I didn't know why there was a preference. So that was great.
It's funny, Lauren and I, when we started this process, we did very little research and just sort of jumped in head first. So we bought our vials before we even had a doctor. But for somebody who's looking for an embryo donor, is there anything different specific to looking for an embryo donor that they should watch out for?
So an embryo donor or an egg donor?
An egg donor, I'm sorry.
Okay, no, that's okay, because there is embryo donation. So I just want to make sure I understood your question. So for egg donors, there are agencies for that as well. Mm-hmm. There's also the option to use a known egg donor. So there are oftentimes, especially with LGBTQ patients, that they will use a sibling. So, they'll use their partner's brother as a sperm donor, or they'll use their partner's sister as the egg donor to kind of get some genetic match in there. And we see that quite often. But if you are using an anonymous donor, they're screened very similarly to sperm donors, except there's a little bit more in depth, because egg donors, so it's expensive to get an egg donor. So, they're getting a psychological exam. They're getting all the FDA required paperwork. Oftentimes we have an idea of what their egg quality looks like. Sometimes even with sperm donor, you can see if they've had previous pregnancies, previous live births, all of that sort of thing. So that may give you some peace of mind when you're choosing an egg donor or a sperm donor. But the process is pretty similar between the two. They're coming in, they're getting some diagnostic work done. They're answering a bunch of questionnaires, especially for egg donors. They are much more strict on what they will allow, or the the guidelines are much stricter. So you have to be at least 21, but I don't think you can be over 32 if it's anonymous. And I know a lot of people are moving away from anonymous donors. They're really wanting someone they at least have some sort of knowledge about, or that's open to having a conversation. So that's very similar. Now I will say with frozen eggs, they don't do as well as fresh eggs. So not that there's anything wrong with frozen eggs. I'm really struggling today. There's nothing wrong with frozen eggs. It's just something to consider. If you are wanting a larger family, oftentimes frozen egg lots are sold in groups of 6. And it's one cell that we're freezing. So their survival rates are much lower than embryos. So if we get a lot of 6, we're expecting at least one of those to die in the thawing process. So that's something to keep in mind. If you're considering a frozen donor, you may consider buying 2 lots. I know there are people who are willing to, especially if they're a sperm provider, because it's much easier to freeze sperm and ship it somewhere. They're willing to go to wherever that donor is and do a fresh cycle, because fresh eggs just across the board do better. They don't have as much stress put on them. Again, it's one cell that we're freezing versus an embryo that has like 150 cells. So that's always something I mention. Again, frozen eggs aren't bad. It's just something to be aware of when you're going through the process, that they're going to die off a little bit easier than embryos will.
That makes sense. So switching gears slightly, I know that you've been pretty vocal on social media recently about what overturning Roe might mean for people going through fertility. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. It is a very big deal. I don't think people really put it in the context of IVF to begin with, because ultimately it will come down to what each state decides to do. But any state that defines personhood at conception and bans abortions at conception, we're going to have issues with IVF, because when we're doing IVF, once we have injected that egg and it's fertilized, we technically can't discard it, because it has personhood, and we would essentially be murdering someone if we discarded that fertilized egg. So there could be regulations, again, depending on the state. On the extreme, they could get rid of IVF altogether, which I don't see happening. I think it's going to be somewhere in the middle. I see some states will likely have regulations on if embryos can be discarded, and that includes abnormal embryos. So if you have an embryo that's genetically tested and it comes back abnormal, you still may have to do some sort of transfer with it. You may not be able to discard it because of the laws that state has. They may not allow all eggs to be fertilized. So there may be a max amount of eggs that can be fertilized with every single retrieval. So other countries have rules like this. Italy for a while, I think Germany for a while had regulations on this, where only up to like 3 eggs could be fertilized, and they all had to be transferred on day 3, regardless of the quality. They may not allow genetic testing altogether. Just a lot of very scary things could be not allowed, depending on what state you're in. Hopefully, I'm pretty certain in states like California and New York, IVF likely won't be touched very much. But in states like Texas and Oklahoma, which Oklahoma has already decided to do their thing, that will have big implications on IVF. A lot of doctors will end up leaving those areas, meaning there'll be less clinics, which there already is issues with people getting access to fertility care. So now it's going to be even harder for people to get fertility care. They may have to drive out of state to get care. I also get concerned for patients who have miscarriages. If they have to go in and do a DNC or an IPAS, that may not be allowed, which absolutely blows my mind, because these are people who want their babies. It's not I have nothing against people who get abortions by any means. But these are people who have worked very hard to grow their family or start their family, and to not be able to have access to safe care is really scary, because it does not stop abortions. It just stops safe abortions. So, and doctors could be penalized for performing care that is necessary. So there are going to be some doctors who leave these states. And that the other side of that is that states that do, that don't have any interruption in their IVF care are going to become overly crowded, because there are people that are traveling from other states to states that have less restrictions, and then they're going to be busy, and there's going to be waits, and it's going to be a hot mess. The whole thing, it scares me a lot. And I don't try to fear monger, but I want to be realistic here. There will absolutely be states where IVF is going to be affected 100%. Like I don't have any doubt in my mind that places like Oklahoma and Texas are going to have restrictions that will affect IVF for sure. So it's something that, it's something to think about if you're considering IVF in a more conservative state. It's a little scary. I've had patients, I've had people reach out to me on social media and say, like, should I move my stuff to another state? And I'm just like, you don't know for sure yet what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
I know it's scary. I'm like, take a breath. You're more than welcome to move things, but, we really won't know until your state decides to do, put in laws or not put in laws, to affect different things. So it's definitely a little scary, especially as an embryologist. Like, I know there are going to be embryologists in certain states that lose their jobs. It's sad and scary.
Absolutely.
It's crazy too, like having just gone through the IVF process and knowing that like there are so many steps throughout it. One, it's like expensive. And then two, there's so many steps throughout it where you're like, that you're going to lose chances. Like that's, you get a certain amount of eggs, a certain amount mature, a certain amount, and you just kind of lose some each time. And that's part of it. So to have limitations on what you can do just reduces the chance of it being successful, and the cost isn't going to change. So that's just,
well, it could go up. Like as a couple who had to purchase vials of sperm, if we were only allowed to fertilize one egg at a time, that in my mind, that means we would have to have purchased significantly more sperm than we did. And that's at least $1,000 a pop. And plus, if you can't dispose of them, that's a $55 a month charge, at least based on what we're paying forever, indefinitely. And then also, if you're forcing people to implant more than one embryo at a time, that increases the likelihood of high-risk pregnancies, multiple pregnancies, and which increases the risk to the mother, to the babies. It's a mess.
It's all around a hot mess. And, physicians are thinking of ways if these laws do go into place to still provide good care. And I think that they have some decent ideas, with if you were in a state that had to transfer all the embryos that were created, there is something called a compassionate transfer, where the embryo is placed in the vagina, not in the uterus. So the chance of pregnancy is very low, or they'll transfer it off cycle, meaning that it's not the correct window of implantation. So it's very unlikely that you get pregnant. But again, those things cost money and take time. So for a patient to have to come in just because they can't get rid of this embryo, like, we're going to force people to pay for that? Like,
it's still a medical procedure. You're forcing medical procedures upon people when they don't want them. It's nuts to me.
And
I think it's outrageous.
If the goal is to like get more people pregnant, I guess, I don't know, then like this doesn't help. I mean, if anything, this is endangering women's lives and making a lot of pregnancies less viable. It's crazy.
It's all around absolutely crazy. And for people who need genetic testing because they and their partner both are carriers of sickle cell or spinal muscular with both, I'm gonna skip that one because I just can't say it. For people who require genetic testing because both them and their partner are carriers of a disease, not being able to get that care, like, they may not allow genetic testing at all. So it's just like, okay, I guess we just are going to be forced to have this risk of having a baby that, is going to suffer or may not live, a few but only a few years and things like that. It's just, I don't know how people can be okay with that, but you know, I guess it's not my perspective, but.
So in terms of like, if people are starting the fertility process in maybe a more conservative state, would you recommend considering going outside to a potentially less conservative state, or trying to work with organizations, or at least preserving either specimen or embryos in a less conservative state?
Or if they can't do that, are there any like red flags to watch out for for care in state?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, anyone who is doing fertility preservation, thankfully, that is a relatively quick procedure. Even if you're doing egg vit, even if you're freezing your eggs, it's typically much shorter of a timeline compared to full-on IVF and FET, that sort of thing. So if you are in a state that's more likely to have laws in place that could restrict your care, and you're doing fertility preservation, typically it's easy to freeze them and then you can send them off site. So you're still usually able to do that procedure in the state because it's so much quicker. The hardest thing is we don't know when exactly all of these laws are going to go into place. So if you're in a state that may be more likely to put laws into place like that, I would definitely be keeping up with the news. Your physician will likely be keeping up with it as well. If they are not, that is definitely a red flag, because you know, most clinics and most physicians I know are very on top of that because they want to be able to advise their patients on what to do. So you want to, you know, if you're going in for initial consult, ask your doctor, say, hey, how could this affect me? What have you seen? Are you keeping up with what's happening? If something does change, how are you going to advise your patients? Because obviously we can't predict the future, but you can be prepared for what, you know, I'm a preparer. So you can be prepared for worst case scenario. And unfortunately, not everyone has the resources to go out of state, which is really unfortunate. So if you are one of those people who can't go out of state, definitely ask your doctor and ask them what measures are they putting into place to, you know, maybe combat these laws, or what are they advising their patients to do when these laws go into place, just so you can be prepared as you can be, you know, when things change. And it's when things change, because they are going to change.
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
I think different topic, but kind of similar vein for, I think in our experience going through the fertility process, there were just some like random things we ran into that made it feel like the process was more set up for cishet couples. I think even down to like little things like the intake forms that we had to fill out. They didn't have a like partner form that was for not men, like for me or non-binary, trans people, like anything, they just weren't set up. So I had to fill out the like same form as Caitlin, had to put in like my menstruation cycle, like all of this. It was like 30 pages instead of one. And that's a small thing, but it's just like a signifier of the process not being set up for you. I'm curious, like in your experience, we were sort of like stuck of like what to do, like how to give feedback or like how to try and make the process feel more for us. Do you have any advice for couples that are feeling similar things or kind of going through the process and running into stuff like that?
Absolutely. And thankfully at the clinic I was at, the physicians did a very good job of trying to make sure that things were set up for any sort of couple or individual who came through, but it wasn't always like that. And we really relied on the feedback of people who did, you know, where it didn't go as how they wished it would. I'm all for giving feedback, whether it seems harsh or not. In the long run, someone else is going to go through it unless it's said, or unless they're hiring someone who has gone through that situation, because oftentimes, you know, they're not thinking about it in that way, which they should be. But couples like you are able to give that feedback and help make things better. We have had patients. The other problem is the systems themselves. So like the EMR, the electronic medical record we use, or that I used to use, made it very difficult to have couples of the same gender or the same reproductive organs. It made it very hard to do. And so we had to find workarounds to be able to make it work. So even when a clinic is wanting to do those things, it like goes up the chain on having to get things fixed, which is really frustrating. But thankfully they were able to kind of get it together. But things like consents, you know, a lot of patients who have online consents, that causes issues, and it's a whole thing. I would definitely bring anyone out there who is having those concerns, I would absolutely bring them up to your physician. To if they ask for feedback at the end of your treatment, I would 100% give your concerns, because those are things that should be fixable. And I mean, you know, it can't be but so hard to make it inclusive. You know, the hardest thing in my experience has been transgender patients, because in some of the things that we do, we have to put their legal name on documents, which we have, you know, we're always open to addressing someone as they'd like to be addressed. But on legal forms, it makes it hard because we have to put their legal name until it's legally changed. And then we also want to note what gametes they have, because at the end of the day, we do need to know, are you producing sperm? Are you producing eggs? And so that part has been the hardest in my experience, because we, you know, if someone is a transgender female, you know, they're producing sperm. So in their chart, we have to put them as male. And that's another EMR thing. Like, we can't put them female in the EMR and then have sperm assigned to it. So some of those things make it more difficult. And the other thing I feel like the clinics can do is be transparent about their shortcomings. Say, hey, we're all welcoming for you to come in and have treatment. This is why we have to do these things. And we've addressed it with our EMR system, and they're working on it, but we want to make sure you're aware of that. And again, we're happy to accommodate as much as we can, and be as inclusive as we can. But these are the things currently that we're working on changing, so that they still, you know, we don't want to have someone come in and be like, oh, they just, you know, I have now transitioned and I'm a female, and they put me in as male, and I've made it very clear that that is not who I am. But it could be a shortcoming of the clinic. And if they're transparent about it, that may help with that communication and relationship between the doctor and the patient.
That's a really good point. I think that in a lot of professional settings, clinics, businesses, et cetera, are very reluctant to come forward with their shortcomings, but it almost builds trust with the individual. If you're like, look, we love having you here. We would love to be able to work with you. Here are the things that we are still working on.
Exactly. I'm all for that. That transparency really, like you said, builds that trust, and makes whoever is coming in feel confident that they are in good hands. Like, no one wants to feel like an outsider, especially when you're paying for an expensive treatment like you're paying for. It's just like, okay, I have to pay for all this and I'm gonna be treated poorly while I'm here. Like, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, absolutely.
I hope that like the healthcare industry, like the EMR, those systems, like insurance too, just I hope they start to make those changes though, because I think it's really exciting for me to read some of the statistics that are happening now, where like the queer community is the fastest growing minority group, and it's 20% of Gen Z, and so many of queer couples want to have kids and want to start families, which I love. I'm so happy, so excited. And so I just hope that, I don't know, people start to make those changes, because I feel like we have to build inclusive systems for the people that exist in the country.
And absolutely, money talks.
Yeah.
I mean, if we're going to be, if 20% of Gen Z identifies as LGBTQ, if businesses want to continue to work with them, they're going to have to adjust.
Yeah,
exactly. And that's how I feel is, you know, over time, those businesses who aren't willing to adapt, they're going to trickle out, because they're, you know, that, like you said, that population of people is only growing. And I do feel like that you kind of get on board or you're out sort of thing. So, but again, I think, you know, if you have the opportunity to give feedback, it does help the clinics, and any clinics who are out there listening, be open with your patients and say, hey, this is one of our shortcomings. We're working on it. we appreciate your patience while we're trying to make it work. And, we'd love to have you as a patient because, in my experience, it wasn't the clinic. The clinic was working so hard to make it all inclusive, but some of the other things were making it hard or were taking a long time. And we're like, oh, I'm really sorry. It's not that we want this. It's just this is the EMR we use and they're taking a long time to kind of get with the program here. So yeah, that's the best way to go about it is what I've seen.
If you had any advice that you would give to queer couples who are starting out on this journey, what would one piece of advice be for them?
Absolutely. The first thing I would suggest is to talk with your partner if you have a partner, or consider yourself, what does my family vision look like? Having that idea of, I don't want to carry, or, I do want to carry, or I want to carry my partner's egg and, someone else's sperm, all of those sorts of things, have a discussion with your partner, think about it yourself. So when you go into your consult, you have some concrete, you can give that vision to your physician and they can discuss with you the steps on how to make that vision a reality. And that is probably my biggest piece of advice because, and I know that there are people there who don't realize all of the options that they have. But having that vision, whether you think it's crazy or not, there may be an option out there for that vision to come true. So, or to make that vision a reality. I don't want to come true like this is in some magic or something, but you know what I mean? So, coming in with that solid vision of what you're looking for can really help guide your doctor in what sort of treatment may be the best fit for you. And that may not be the best fit for you financially or things like that, but you'll get more information about what options are out there if you come in with the vision that you're, considering in terms of building your family. That's definitely my biggest piece of advice. My other big piece of advice is if you're using a known donor, please fill out the paperwork and go see a reproductive lawyer and go to reproductive psychology, get them tested, all of that, especially their sperm. Get them a semen analysis. It's relatively inexpensive. You don't want to be working with a known donor who has no sperm. I have heard some horror stories of people just finding random people on the internet, and that's so scary to me. It's fine if you find them on the internet, just go do some testing first before you use them as a donor.
When we started on the process, I joined a bunch of Facebook groups just to see what people are asking, learn more. One for our fertility clinic and one called, I think it was called Lesbians Trying to Conceive. Oh. And there was a lot of people on there that were using I guess known donors, but people they didn't know that they found online. And then we watched what was
Nuclear Family,
a documentary on a lesbian couple who did that same process in the probably 80s, and ended up having a kind of a custody battle over the kids. And so when we went into this process, we were like, okay, if we do this, we were like, yeah, I think that's such great advice because people don't think about it. And even if it's someone that they do know, you have to have those protections in place because it's your family and your kids and, yeah.
Exactly. We don't I don't want anyone to be devastated when someone isn't who they thought they were, and they come for that child or something else. It's just that would not go well, and we want to try to avoid those sort of things. The other thing I'll mention is, and this might be relevant to y'all, is if both partners have a uterus, regardless of if you're married or not, the partner who is not carrying has to legally adopt the baby of their other partner who is carrying, which is really ridiculous. But again, that is something that we don't want to end up being an issue later on. Even if you're on the birth certificate, you really want to talk to a reproductive lawyer. And Jenna, who I follow on Instagram, I'll have to grab her handle. Maybe I'll email it to y'all. She talks, yes, she's awesome. Yep. She posts the best information, a lot of my information on LGBTQ couples I get from her, because she's also, she has a baby with her wife, or a couple of babies with her wife. And she gives fantastic information. She's got she's a great resource for reproductive lawyers, and she's got lots of resources on her site. So she's a great person to look up and look into all of her stuff, because she's got fantastic information on her page.
Absolutely. I also follow her, and we learned about second parent adoption through her. Even though I'm an attorney, that's not my area of expertise. And that was sort of the catalyst for us starting down this process. And just to add to something that you said, although it can be a little upsetting to see the price tag of either getting a reproductive lawyer to write you these contracts or a family attorney to go through second parent adoption, although that price tag can be a little off-putting, having to litigate these things on the back end is going to cost you 1,000,000 times more than if you just do it right the first time.
Yeah, so that's my biggest advice, is to make sure you've got everything together legally with you and your partner when going through the process, because we don't want any babies taken from their families.
No,
yeah, that's a bad. Yeah.
So is there anything that you want to promote? You want to talk about, do you want to give your handles, like where to follow you?
Yeah, so you can follow me on Instagram at Alease_the_embryologist, and then on TikTok at Alease the Embryologist. And then I've got a website coming soon. It has been coming soon for way too long, but my goal is to have it out at the end of June. So that is just AleaseTheEmbryoLogist.com. I'm going to be offering some cool education courses. I'm starting my very first course I'll be offering is embryo grading, because like I said, that is my most asked question. But I am also going to be offering some one-on-one coaching, and I plan to have some LGBTQ centered courses as well, because my last little spiel is that there is options out there. There are options out there for building the family that you want. So don't get discouraged if you've read somewhere or something else or you feel, that there isn't an option out there for you, because there definitely is. So yeah, I thank you for having me on. It was such a good time. I hope you have a great afternoon. And again, safe rest of your pregnancy. And
awesome.
Thank you so much.
Have a great weekend.
Yeah.
Have a good one.
Yeah, you too. Bye.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Happy Queer Adults.
Our music is by Kevin Burke at Kevin Burke Music, and our artwork is by Mike O'Brien at Red Table Press.
We are releasing new episodes the first Wednesday of each month.
If you have an LGBT Q&A for us, please submit them to happyqueeradults@gmail.com or send us a DM on Instagram.
You can find us at happyqueeradults.com or at happyqueeradults on Instagram and TikTok, and Happy Queer Pod on Twitter.
You can watch full episodes of our show on YouTube, as well as listen on Spotify and Apple Podcasts.
If you liked what you heard and want more content from us, please leave a 5-star review.
Again, thank you so much for listening, and have a very happy, very queer day.